When you hear the name John Calvin, what's the first word that pops into your head? For a lot of people, it's predestination. And that's a word that can sound pretty intimidating, maybe even a little scary. It brings up these images of a distant God just making random choices. But what if that whole picture we have in our heads is just wrong? Okay, let's dive in and unpack the real story here.
We're going to kick things off with this bombshell of a quote from theologian Carl Trueman. A myth? How can that possibly be? Well, stick with me, because we're about to see how the real story of John Calvin and his most famous doctrine isn't one of grim fatalism at all. It's actually a story about grace, comfort, and the person of Jesus Christ. All right, so first up, let's just tackle this bigger-than-life caricature of Calvin head-on. Was he really this lonely, obsessive architect of predestination that history kind of makes him out to be?
Well, first off, the idea that Calvin just invented this doctrine out of thin air, not true. He was really just standing in a long line of thinkers that goes all the way back to Augustine and includes Martin Luther. And in his day, his views weren't seen as some radical new thing. They were pretty conventional for the Reformation. His big contribution wasn't innovation, it was clarity. And he wasn't some lone wolf theologian either. He was more like the first among equals, a key voice in a whole choir of other reformers. You see, he saw himself first and foremost as a pastor and a teacher. His main goal was to take what he believed the Bible taught, especially from the Apostle Paul, and just make it clear and understandable for the church. He wasn't trying to build something new, he was trying to faithfully explain something ancient. So, to really get what Calvin meant by predestination, we have to stop looking at some abstract heavenly decree. We need to start looking somewhere else entirely, at Jesus Christ. For the Reformers, this was the whole point. Predestination wasn't really a doctrine about who's in and who's out. It was a framework to protect one central truth, that salvation is a completely, 100% free gift from God. It's gratuitous. That's a fancy word that just means it's totally unearned and undeserved. This idea was the absolute bedrock for them. And Calvin used this really powerful analogy to make it personal. He said, look, if you want to understand your election, your standing with God, don't try to peek into some secret file cabinet in heaven. Just look at Christ. He is the mirror that reflects God's favor and grace right back to you. What a beautiful and tangible way to think about it.
And you can see this laser focus on Christ in all the documents from that time. Take the Scots Confession, for example, written by Calvin's student John Knox. When it talks about election, it focuses entirely on Jesus, his birth, his life, his death. There's no mention of some hidden abstract decree. For them, God's choice was made visible and real in his Son. Okay, now we get to what might be the most shocking part of this whole story. What if I told you that this doctrine, the one we so often associate with anxiety and fear, was originally meant to be a source of profound comfort? It seems like a complete contradiction, doesn't it? I mean, how can you find peace in something that seems so final and so hidden? It's the question that just naturally pops into your mind. And it's one the Reformers had a powerful answer for. And what's so fascinating is that Calvin himself warned people against doing the very thing his critics accused him of promoting. He said that trying to figure out God's hidden will on your own, separate from what we see in Jesus, is like wandering into a maze you can never escape. He knew it only leads to anxiety and despair. He was deeply worried about the pastoral damage that kind of speculation could cause. And he wasn't the only one. Check this out from the 39 Articles, a foundational document for the Church of England. They don't just say predestination is okay, they say that when you consider it the right way, that is, in Christ, it is full of sweet, pleasant, and unspeakable comfort. So what did they see that we so often miss? Here it is. This is the absolute key. The great shift of the Reformation was to connect predestination directly to the assurance of salvation. Their logic went like this. If your salvation depends even 1 tiny % on your own efforts, your own choices, or your own goodness, then you can never really be sure of it, right? Because we all mess up. But if it depends 100% on God's unchanging grace, anchored in Christ, then it is absolutely secure. It can't be lost because you never earned it in the first place. That was the source of all that comfort. But as you can probably guess, a doctrine that was designed to give believers this unshakable security soon became a source of deep, profound division. That very certainty that the Reformers saw as a comfort, well, others saw it as a threat to human free will. And this tension is what lit the fuse on one of the most explosive debates in church history.
So the main challenge came from a Dutch theologian named Jacob Arminius. And he introduced a really critical shift in thinking. He argued that, yeah, God offers grace to everyone, but we humans have the free will to either accept it or resist it. And that simple-sounding change, it has a massive implication. Suddenly, salvation isn't solely God's work anymore. It's a cooperative project between God and us, which reintroduces that very human uncertainty the reformers were trying to eliminate. This whole debate eventually got boiled down into the famous 5 points that are still argued about today. On one side, you've got the Calvinist position, with ideas like irresistible grace and unconditional election. And on the other, you have the Arminian view, which really emphasizes that grace can be resisted and that election is based on God looking ahead and seeing a person's faith. These points just show you how deep the fault line between these two views really is. So let's pull all these threads together. At the end of the day, this centuries-long, super complex debate really comes back to that one key pastoral question that Calvin and the other reformers were so worried about: assurance. This really gets to the heart of their anxiety. They believe that if salvation is a cooperative effort, then the whole chain of salvation is only as strong as its weakest link. And let's be honest, that weakest link is always going to be our own fragile, up-and-down human will. For them, that was not a foundation for comfort, but for constant, nagging doubt. And that leaves us with the central question that has been echoing through the church ever since. Can a person have genuine, unshakable assurance if their ultimate destiny hinges, even in the smallest way, on their own decision? It's a question that forces us all to think really deeply about the nature of grace, the nature of faith, and what it truly means to be saved.